More or less? All right, so who can tell me what redlining is? Practice of redlining. Yeah.
This is a practice where banks would draw red lines on maps around neighborhoods they didn't like, and they wouldn't recommend getting loans to these places, investing there.
Well, it wasn't neighborhoods that they didn't like, it was neighborhoods that they perceived as high mortgage risk.
Yeah.
So they basically color-coded cities. And this was actually done not by banks, but by the Homeowners Loan Corporation. Who can tell me what the Homeowners Loan Corporation is? Yeah.
I mean, it's like part of the government that tried to help people get loans for their investments.
Yeah, when did this happen?
Like after the Recession, New Deal.
Yeah, this is a New Deal program. So this was one of the New Deal programs established in 1933. The goal was, of course, to keep people in their homes because a lot of people were at risk of losing their homes during the Great Depression because they just lacked the money to pay back their mortgages. And so during this time, the Homeowners Loan Corporation was in the business of refinancing people's mortgages so that they could presumably get a mortgage that they could afford, and then they wouldn't risk losing their home during this economic downturn. The most recent economic downturn in this country has been the recession that has been brought on by the pandemic. What are some things that the government have done in terms of loan repayment during the pandemic? You guys should be aware of one of these because I suspect all of you have this type of loan.
Didn't they like pause payments for
They've paused payments on student loans.
Yeah.
So if you have a student loan, was that what you were gonna say?
I was gonna say forgiveness for, it wouldn't be loans, it would be like landlords.
That's another thing. So let me talk about student loans here for a minute. So they've paused payments on student loans. So if you hold a student loan, you don't have to worry about this because your student loan doesn't start kicking in terms of you having to repay it until 6 months after you graduate. So if you graduate from Jewel and then you enroll in graduate school or law school or something else, then that just puts it off even further. As long as you're in school, the payments on those loans don't come into effect. But if you graduated and you were paying on those student loans, there's been, I guess, almost 2 years now, there's been a hiatus on loan payments. So if you do have a student loan and you can afford to pay for it, it's good for you to pay on it during this hiatus because you're paying down principal while not being charged interest on that loan, which is nice. The other thing that happened is the what would you call it? Basically, this rule that you couldn't evict people for not paying the rent or for not paying their mortgages during this time period. That's expired at a federal level, although it's still in place in some states. But that was largely driven by the federal government. This moratorium, that was the word I was thinking of, a moratorium on evictions during this time period. So, Homeowners Loan Corporation designed to refinance people's mortgages so that they wouldn't lose their homes during the Depression. They color-coded these in 4 levels, A, B, C, and D. From best risk to worst risk. And once again, this risk that they were basing this on is the mortgage risk, and this was mainly intended for lenders who are writing mortgages and loaning money to people who want to buy homes to refinance their homes. And the mortgage risk is the risk of not paying back the mortgage. And then at that point, if you fail to pay back the mortgage, the bank forecloses on your house, and you lose your house and you have to go and find some other place to live. How familiar are you guys with how mortgages work? Who can explain how mortgages work? A mortgage is a loan, but it's different than a personal loan. What are some of the fundamental differences between, for example, a mortgage and a personal loan? Yeah.
They can repossess my house if I don't pay it.
Okay, so a mortgage is a loan that is made by a bank to a person planning on buying a house. And in this case, the collateral for the loan is the house itself. What do we mean when we use the term collateral?
What happens when you don't pay?
So it's a durable good that you put up as support for the loan, so that if you don't pay on the loan, the lender will take that durable good and they can sell it and they can earn the profits from that sale to basically repay back the loan that you weren't paying back. So in the case of a home, homes are really expensive. Homes cost more than most people have cash laying around to buy. And so what you do is you take out a loan to buy a house because it's this large expense, and the house itself is the collateral. So you start paying on the mortgage, you pay your monthly rates, and 30 years later, you've paid off that mortgage, and you are now the sole owner of the house. So let's say that you buy a $100,000 house. Let's say you pay a $20,000 down payment. You now have an $80,000 payment left over that you have to come up with. So you take out a mortgage for this. And if you were to sell that house the day that you buy it, you would presumably sell it for $100,000. You would pocket the $20,000 that you put in as a down payment, and you would give the other $80,000 to the bank to pay off the mortgage. Over time, let's say that you've been in your house 15 years, you've paid off $40,000 of the house, so you now still owe $40,000 on your house. This $40,000 is now considered equity, just as the down payment is considered equity as well. What do we mean by the term equity? When you have equity in your house, what does that mean?
How much you own?
It's how much you own. So now, after being in this house for 15 years and you've paid off half of the debt, if you were to sell that house for $100,000, you would take that $100,000, you would pay 40 of it back to the bank, which means that you would have $60,000 left over in your pocket in terms of cash. And what most people do when they sell a house is they turn around and buy a house, so you could actually use that money to pay off debts if you wanted to, but you could also use that money to just put down as a down payment on another house. And so if you were going to buy another $100,000 house, you pay $60,000 down on it, you would have $40,000 mortgage. Banks would love you. They would see you as very low risk because you put a down payment of $60,000 on the house, and you would get a really good interest rate on your mortgage as a result of that. In the same way that you'll get a really good interest rate if you pay down as little as $20,000 on a house. So what does this mean for wealth, for building wealth? It's said in economic circles that home ownership is the single most important factor in building what's known as intergenerational wealth. What do we mean by that term? Yeah.
Wealth that enables you to pass that.
Okay, so wealth that is able to be passed on, wealth that becomes part of your family legacy, wealth that transfers from one generation to the next generation. Why would homeownership be so important to that? Jameson's looking quizzical. He's probably thinking, I thought this was a course about food. This is a course about life. Somebody other than Aiden. I'm tired of Aiden already. It's 9:10. Yeah.
I mean, the less you have paid off, the less they get to collect on it if they were to sell it, or the more they owe the bank if they're going to keep it, right? Because they would have to pay it off.
I'm not sure I'm following you.
If a child were to inherit the house and you had $80,000 left to pay on it, you
Yeah.
would have to pay $80,000.
Yeah, so if you die and you still have all of that amount still to pay on the house, then if that house was willed to your children, they would inherit that debt, but they would probably sell that house and they would pay back the $80,000 and they would pocket $20,000. So that $20,000 in down payment that you put on the house would actually go right into the pocket of your children. If you suffered the unfortunate fate of dying on the day that you closed on your house. Hopefully you're not dying on the day that you close on your house. Hopefully you are paying that house off over long periods of years. A 30-year loan is a pretty typical home loan. So when you buy a house, you're kind of in it for the long haul. So if you die after 15 years of living in the house and you've paid off $40,000, if you will that house to your children, they now have $60,000 of equity that they didn't have to work for themselves, that you actually worked for, and you pass that equity on to them. If they move into the house, they could continue paying the house note, but now they get a $100,000 house for what is essentially $40,000. Not to mention, nowadays, a mortgage payment is in many cases lower than rent in many areas, especially here in the Northland. And so you might be moving from a rental space where you're paying $1,200 a month to live in a space into a house that was only $700 or $800 a month. So you would actually be saving money that way. When you buy a house and you live in it until you pay it off, and then the house is fully owned by you, if you pass that house on to your offspring, you're passing them on an object of considerable value. Hopefully, if you've lived in a house, if you've lived in a house for 15 years, your house is no longer $100,000. It has probably done what over time? It has appreciated. Oftentimes, housing appreciates rather than depreciates. Cars, on the other hand, what happens to a car as soon as you drive it off the lot? Oh, it's lost all of its value as soon as you drive that thing off the lot. Which is why, what will a bank typically give you a loan for a car for? 15 years, 30 years? 5 years is the typical loan repayment schedule for a car, because cars are not things that generally maintain or gain value over time. They're things that tend to lose value over time. Houses, on the other hand, tend to gain value over time. If you bought a $100,000 house in 2004, you would see that house now worth about $130,000. So if you sold that house today, you would sell it for about $130,000, which means that you would have the $20,000 of equity that you put into it on the down payment, plus the $40,000 that you've put into it paying off the loan, which was $100,000, but you would now sell that house for $130,000. You would pay back the bank the $40,000, and rather than the $60,000 that you have in equity, you now have $90,000 in equity. Because the equity, as measured by your loan payments, is only based on the amount of the loan that you pulled out, not the amount that the property is valued in the current market. This is my house. I paid $102,000 for it in 2004. If you look online, it's now valued at about $130,000. I have about $60,000 still left to pay on it. But once again, it's increased in value $30,000. So I have a considerable amount of equity. I've got about $70,000, $80,000 of equity in the house right now if I were to sell it, which I'm not planning on selling it. But if I was, this is how you build wealth. You sit on a property that is going to gain value. You pay off the loan on that property over time so that you're building real equity in terms of paying off the loan, but you're also building another form of real equity if the house is appreciating in value, such that you can sell the house for way more than you bought it for, simply because you've lived in it for a while. This is how you build intergenerational wealth. If you're not like independently wealthy and inherited a bunch of money from your parents, which who of us is in that situation? My dad was in road construction, and my mom was a librarian at a public library in a town of 4,000 people. This is how you build intergenerational wealth. You then take that equity and you pass that equity on to your kids when you die by leaving them in your house. They either move into the house or they sell the house and they get all of the equity that you had in it. One of the cool things about selling a house, they don't charge you taxes on that sale. Because the government intends for you to take that money and sink it into a new house. There's no rule that you have to take any profits from selling your house and sink it into a new house. But in order to encourage home ownership, states and the federal government don't generally tax the sales on residential real estate that you own, which is also nice. So if you have been unwise and you've racked up $20,000 in credit card debt, you could actually pay off that credit card debt with part of the proceeds of your house sale and get out of debt and then still have a chunk of money to put down on whatever your next house is. Or you can just go to the casino and let it fly. So your ability to get a mortgage is a really big deal in terms of building wealth at an individual level, but also building what's known as intergenerational wealth. So what the Homeowners Loan Corporation did was back in the 1930s, they went to all of the major metropolitan areas that you can see on the map there, and they basically divvied up the cities as they existed at that time into areas that were high risk for making mortgages and areas that were low risk for making mortgages. This is a site at University of Richmond that basically shows all of the major redlined areas. And for each city, it has a circle that represents what proportion of the land area was red line versus yellow line versus green line versus blue line. And as you can see, what does Kansas City look like? There's a big proportion of Kansas City that was redlined at this particular point in history. And so A is the best, B is still desirable, C is definitely declining, and D is quote hazardous. Yeah?
Why are some circles bigger than others?
Population size. So Kansas City at the time was a relatively small city. Chicago is a big city. The boroughs, so New York looks small because they've divided it up by borough. So they've taken the whole big city of New York and divided it up into the 5 boroughs, which is why it looks smaller. But in reality, it's 5 of these. Probably the 5 biggest of these circles is New York City as a whole. So the size of the circle is weighted by population. For example, Kansas City at the time was a relatively large city. Houston is now way bigger than Kansas City, but it's a small lot because it wasn't a huge city like that back in the day. So this is the redlining thing, and I sent you to the Kansas City map and asked you to look at things. So you can see areas of the city that are redlined. You can see areas of the city that are blue lined and areas of the city that are green lined. When you look at the written description of these areas, what were some things that struck you? Did you guys go and read the written descriptions I asked you to click on? It is fascinating reading. You should definitely click on it. So when you click on it, you can get a full description. You can just get a description and characteristics. You can actually look at the actual scan, which shows you the actual typed up document. What appears over here is just the description. There's a lot of information in this actually. Percentage Negro, percentage foreign families, what types of construction tends to be in this part of town, what percentage of it is new construction, a bunch of things about loans and things like this. And then there's a description of the area and characteristics of the area. I find these things to be relatively interesting to read through. So I'm in section D25, and if you haven't gone and looked there, find D25 and go and look real quick. What are your impressions of this place? As described by the Homeowners Loan Corporation.
What's the question?
What are your impressions? What are your thoughts? Think. It's a simple thing.
I mean, like, that's horrible.
What's horrible about it?
Like, basing who should be able to invest off of, like, traits that aren't, you can't decide.
But evidently you can, and people did. This far-flung area containing the principal Negro habitat of Kansas City, Missouri is that old section where values were shot several years ago. The colored belt extends from the vicinity of Troost east to the vicinity of Cleveland, south to 27th Street, and north to the vicinity of 12th Street. Scattered throughout the Negro district is a typical wide variety of large old houses, poorly kept, occupied by low-income wage earners and laborers. This is true of the outer fringe, where the Negro section is a typical colored area, ragged in every respect. Throughout the large area is one where values have fluctuated very little in the last few years, with demand for property negligible. 15th Street and 18th Street are Negro business districts. Scattered throughout the area are a large number of small factories and commercial institutions, such as laundries and similar service establishments. In this respect, it suffers from the fact that the district was built up long before Kansas City had zoning restrictions. Throughout the area are a large number of apartments, particularly along 9th Street, the Paseo, and other streets. Many of these are in the colored areas as well as other parts of the districts. There are a number of Negro apartments rented for $25 a unit, otherwise $20 per unit is the maximum. The ratio of assessed value to market value is high. You can't tell me you don't have thoughts about that description. Adam has shared his. What about the rest of you?
I mean, also, like, just driving around, it's clear, like, the effects of this are still prevalent.
Okay, so that's one of the things that I want to talk about later. So this is something that happened back in the 1930s. What we're going to discuss today and on Wednesday and part of the day on Friday probably is has this system actually put its thumbprint on Kansas City, a thumbprint that we can see to the year 2021. And I would argue that it has, but we're going to explore that in a little more detail. Somebody other than Adam. How do I navigate around this? Also asked you to go and look at D19. So these are all the D areas, is what I gave you first to look at. D19, if you're familiar with this is the area around Cliff Drive and down into the river bottoms. If you're familiar with this area of town, this is also where Garazzo's, which is an Italian restaurant, is located. Belvedere Hollow is situated on low ground running north from Independence Avenue, practically a slum area occupied by Negroes, Mexican, and low-grade Italians. I'm not sure what a low-grade Italian is as opposed to a high-grade Italian, but low-grade Italians evidently live here. There is no demand for this in this area for property. Many places have been abandoned for taxes by institutions and individual owners. There are a large number of apartments in the area running from 3 to 12 units. As a whole, one of the 2 or 3 very bad or slum districts of Kansas City. Restriction of immigration hurts this area. It was one that usually received all Italian newcomers and a section from which they graduated when economically able. So this is where low-grade Italians live and where they try and get out of as soon as they're financially able to. Thoughts? Reflections? Aiden, you're wiggling around in your seat. Jennison?
Well, there's no really rationale behind like why there wouldn't be an ability to pay back, right? It's really just about, well, this is a kind of person that we see as negative, therefore don't give them a mortgage, not that they won't be able to pay it back, I guess.
It doesn't have any basis on any economics. Nowadays, when you go to get a mortgage, what do? Or any kind of loan. You guys probably never gotten a loan.
Background checks.
They do background checks on you, but in particular, they do what? They do a credit history check on you, right? They see if you've run up a bunch of credit card bills. They see if you've had loans in the past and paid those back. They actually see if you have a mortgage on your house. The thing that happens right after you get a mortgage, guess what happens at your house when you move in? You get a lot of junk mail from banks. Banks that are not your bank. Banks that are not the bank that gave you the mortgage. What's in those banks? Those letters from banks. None of you have ever bought a house, clearly. Why have you guys not bought houses yet? Banks send you letters basically saying, hey, come bank with us. Better yet, take out a loan from us. Why do they think you're a good bet? Because another bank just gave you a big honkin' loan. And if they thought you were a good bet, well, we probably think you're a good bet also. People tend to give credit to people who already have good credit. One of the easiest ways to establish credit is to buy a house. Buying a car is a good way to build credit. When I went to buy my first car, it's my first new car actually, first new car of my life. I was an assistant professor at Williamsville College. I grew up, my dad was in road construction. I literally grew up in a family of 2 dads, 4 kids. We lived in a 3-bedroom mobile home. Out in the country in central Texas. I shared a room with my youngest sister until I was a sophomore in high school. When she was born and got out of her crib, I built, out of rough lumber from the hardware store, I built bunk beds. When I went away to graduate school, I went home, I sawed the bunk beds in 2 and took my half with me. When I went to buy my first car, I had never established any credit. I was an assistant professor at Williamsville College in my first year here. My wife needed a car to commute to her job. We had 1 car at the time. I had not ever built up any credit because I was raised in a situation where my parents were concerned, where we didn't ever buy something that we didn't have cash for because we didn't know if we were going to be able to pay it off. And so I went to the car place and got a loan for the car, and basically what the guy who sold us the car told us was, your wife has excellent credit. You don't have any credit. You don't have bad credit, but you don't have good credit. You are a vacuum. We don't have any information on you credit-wise. You need to build credit. Like, we put you into our computer to look for your credit score. You don't have one because you've never done anything that would cause you to have a credit score. We have some things about you've rented apartments and stuff like that, but that's not really how you build a credit score. So some of the best advice that I got from this guy was, buy the car, don't pay it off early. It was being financed through another institution. He was just giving us advice on how to build credit. He said, buy a car, don't pay it off early. I can tell from the fact that you don't have credit, but you're a PhD, you work at a university, you've basically been living on cash for your entire life. Buy the car, pay it off in full, on time, don't pay it off early. When you're at the end of that, you're going to have a good credit rating because you've kind of played by societal rules for building credit. And we did that. And then when we went to buy our house, we went to the mortgage guy, and he ran our credit score, and he basically came back and said, you have walk-on, what we call in the business, walk-on water credit. Basically, the best credit rating that you can have as a human being in that category of credit ratings. You know how much money they approved us for buying a house in 2004? It's ridiculous. They were prepared to give us a loan for $350,000. Me and my wife, we were both college professors, we were both working at Jewel. I looked at the mortgage guy, I'm like, you're out of your mind. No way in hell are we going to take out a loan for $350,000. That's ridiculous. This is actually what led to the housing crisis of 2008. Banks making loans to people like me for $350,000. That's ridiculous. No wonder things collapsed. I bought a $100,000 house, 2 bedrooms, 1.5 bath in the historic district. It's nice, it's adequate, I love it. I sunk a good amount of money into it. I'm happy there. I would be much less happy in a $350,000 house because I would be struggling to pay the note on that house. Because that mortgage officer was on crack. Build credit. You get a small loan, pay it off on time. Don't be late on payments. Build up that credit. That good credit allows you to get a good rate on a house, get a mortgage, pay that thing off, build some equity. With that equity, you can move up to a bigger house as your family grows, if you're having kids and things like this. Sell that house, take the equity, put it as a down payment on the next house as you build the size of your family until you finally have a house that is big enough for you, and then just stop buying houses. Just sit in that house for 30 years, pay it off, and then at the end of that, you have this pocket of wealth that you didn't have when you were 22. This is how Americans build wealth, how normal Americans build wealth. I don't know how rich people build wealth, but this is how normal Americans build wealth. And it's the kind of wealth that you pass on from generation to generation. Unless you're a family in a redline district in the 1930s. And then you can't get a loan, or you get a loan that is at such a high interest rate that you can't afford the payments, so you get into a mortgage that you can't pay off, and you get foreclosed on by the bank that made you the loan. And then your credit rating goes to the toilet, and you can't get a loan to do anything else. This applies to residential areas. This applies to these residential areas where low-grade Italians live in Kansas City. And now you can go and get pretty decent Italian food. Where else did I have you go and read? You guys recognize the geography of Kansas City? This is the Missouri River up here. So Kansas City didn't extend very far south in the 1930s, but it extended far enough south that you get into this area here. This is a green area. This is A8, I think. Is that right? A8. Yeah, this is one of the places that I sent you to. Go to A8 and read the description. When you're done, thoughts?
This is obviously a rich area, always a rich area.
What's different about the language?
It just makes it, there's no, like, any shade towards any of the people of color, and there's no people of color in this area.
Well, there's no people of color in the area to throw shade at.
And then there's a lot of, it talks about, pretty much brags about how much better it is, that nicer houses in that area. And like it talks about the cost of them, and it didn't talk about that in the redlined areas.
Oh, yeah. These are artistically located in rolling hills. Like the whole language that is used to describe this area is different. I used to be married to a linguist. I pay attention to language. Like, there are rolling hills in other parts of the city, but they're not artistic rolling hills.
And then it says like Gold Coast of Kansas City.
Yeah, yeah. Continues to be the Gold Coast of Kansas City with adjoining Mission Hills. The outstanding exclusive residential subdivisions. What do they mean by exclusive?
It's only for the people of higher class, because if you go look, there's no apartments or anything in that area, straight houses.
It's all houses, but that actually isn't what they mean by exclusive. You guys familiar with J.C. Nichols? Tell me about what you know of J.C. Nichols. J.C. Nichols is the guy who developed the Country Club Plaza. He's also the one who developed this section of town. He was a real estate developer in the first part of the 20th century. Died in 1950, I think. He was 69 years old, so he was developing Kansas City during this time period. What can you tell me about J.C. Nichols?
Pretty big fan of separation of power and equity.
Explain to me what you mean by that.
You can look at this, but it's like segregation without it. It's like legal segregation. He wanted to keep certain groups away from each other.
You guys familiar with what homeowners associations are?
Yeah.
What's a homeowners association?
It's like an association that you pay into wherever you live that has certain rules in place that are different from like the city or.
Yes, they have rules about how you keep your house, what setbacks are, things like this. J.C. Nichols had homeowners associations in all of his developments, and he also had control over how the deeds were written. What are deed restrictions?
Controls you put on who can and who can't buy the property.
Oh yeah, it's weird. It's a restriction on who can and can't buy a property. Now one would think that if you own your house, you've been sitting in your house for 30 years, you've paid your last payment on your homeowner's loan, your mortgage. People oftentimes have a mortgage burning party when they finish paying off their house. They used to, I don't know if they do anymore, but people of my parents' generation, when they paid off their home, they would take their mortgage documents, they would put them in a container, or put them in the fireplace, or put them in a burning pit outside, and they would set the mortgage on fire because they paid off the mortgage. And now the house is 100% theirs. It is not owned at all by the bank. At that point, one would think that you should be able to sell that house to whoever you please, right? But not if there's a deed restriction. What kinds of deed restrictions do you think J.C. Nichols put on houses in these green areas where he was developing? Jews, no Italians, no blacks. You can't move in here, and if you own a house here, you can't sell your house to one of those groups of people. This is well documented once again in the deed documents. There are people who are trying to get their deeds changed to remove those deed restrictions from their deeds so that they can sell their house to whoever they like. And there's actually quite a lot of resistance to removing those deed restrictions. This is a good part of town, according to the Homeowners Loan Corporation, partly because it's exclusive. And it's not exclusive because it doesn't have apartments. It's exclusive because only one type of person can live there. I asked you to look at this red area over here. So there's red areas here, here, here. You see these two red areas. They go out to the west. What's the line that they're bordered on the west? Does anybody know? It was mentioned in one of the descriptions earlier. Unfortunately, zooming in doesn't really help you. It's very hard to read street names.
Isn't it Troost?
It is Troost. Very good. You know your Kansas City geography. What is Troost generally viewed as here in Kansas City?
I mean, it's kind of known as like the separation of like.
Yeah, it's kind of a
Or-
dividing line.
yeah.
It's often referred to as a racial dividing line.
Yeah.
Predominantly African American communities on the east side of Troost, predominantly white areas on the west side of Troost. And so this dividing line is seen in these maps in that you see a lot of redlined areas to the east of Troost, and you see a lot of yellow, green, blue areas to the west of Troost. Once again, here's the blue area here. From this blue area, you transition to this yellow area and then into a red area over here. The east side of that blue area is Troost Avenue. You see that this line lines up directly with this line up here. The east side of this is the west side of this. So I asked you to look at, I can't exactly find them because I'm just not very good at this. Oh, there's CTI. So here's a blue area, here's a yellow area, and here's a red area. So I also asked you to look at these three. So go and look at them. You can go red, yellow, or blue, yellow, and red. It doesn't really matter to me. Click on those and read those descriptions for a few minutes if you haven't already done it. B13, C37, and B32. Thoughts on these three areas as you move from east to west?
I think it's weird to talk about like pride of ownership. That's just a
Did they,
weird concept.
did they take a survey? Yeah, so the redlined area on the east side is referred to as ratty, the ratty, ill-kept, et cetera, et cetera. The area on the west is referred to as nice, substantial brick houses, brick bungalows, et cetera, et cetera. So what happens to a section of town if everybody in that section of town has difficulty getting a mortgage? What are your choices if you can't get a mortgage to buy a house? You have to rent. So you get a section of town that is filled with rental properties. When you rent a property, is there any incentive for you to do any upkeep on that property? No, you rent it, you don't own it. Why are you going to invest money in that? In terms of the owner of a rental property, what is the incentive for them to upkeep a rental property?
The incentive is to get like more attendance, but if there's no issue getting like customers or clients, like people to live in your place, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, so you might fix up a place if you want to rent it to people, if there's more housing than people who need housing. You might want to make improvements on a place if you think that you can get a higher rent for it. But if there's already a lot of people looking for rental properties because they can't get a mortgage, and you're not gonna get any more money out of these people because of course they're not getting money for things like mortgages, they probably don't have money for other things as well, you're not going to probably be making improvements to these areas simply because you don't need to in order to get renters there. So the rental properties decline over time because there's little incentive on the part of either the rentor or the landlord to make any improvements because the landlord's not hurting for renters. Over time, if these rental properties that make up large bulks of these sections of towns are in decline, what happens to property tax values, property values? Property values decline. As property values decline, what happens to your ability to get a mortgage in those sections of town in the event that you do have the ability to buy a house? Ain't going to make a mortgage on a property that has relatively little value? If you don't pay your mortgage and they foreclose on it, what's going to happen to the money that they've lent you? It's just lost money because you can't sell that property because that property is already of low value, so they're not going to give you a mortgage. When they can't give you a mortgage, you're going to rent instead, and you get caught in this downward spiral of property values. Why else are property values important? We talked about this once or twice before. I just got my property tax bill.
I mean, you can get into like schooling and stuff like that, but
My property taxes, like $700 and some odd dollars for my house. No, $1,100 for my house. About 800 of it are property taxes that go to funding the Liberty Public School. Wow, education. And if only I had been educated adequately, I could spell education. A big chunk of that $1,100, almost $800 of it, goes to the Liberty Public School. Guess who doesn't have kids in the Liberty Public School? No children. Yet I pay $800 a year in property taxes to support Liberty Public Schools. You know what? For God's sakes, raise my property taxes. In my mind, good public education is our first line of defense against descending into chaos. unfortunately, there's been a bit of chaos in the United States lately. I think part of that is because we don't invest enough in public schools. Why am I so willing to pay property taxes to support public schools, other than the fact that I'm an educator and I teach at a college? Quite frankly, the better public school education you have, the easier my job is. But beyond that selfish perspective, why would I be willing to pay property taxes for kids to go to school when I don't even have kids?
The value of your property goes down.
I really don't care that much about it, but that's probably true, yes. One of the things that real estate agents use when they advertise living in Liberty is they have great schools. Why do we have great schools? Well, we have high property values. High property values lead to high property taxes. High property taxes fund better schools. Yeah.
It is good to have citizens who are well educated, even if they're not your children.
Yes, certainly that's good. That was my point of our first defense against chaos is a well-educated populace. Guess where I went to school? Lampasas Independent School District, Central Texas. Guess what paid for that school? Probably somewhere some guy without kids paying his property taxes. Public school from kindergarten to high school, went to a state institution for my bachelor's and my master's degree, and I went to a state institution for my PhD. For better or worse, I am a product of state-funded public education in the state of Texas. When I was an undergraduate, students would come to schools in Texas from other states because out-of-state tuition in Texas schools was cheaper than in-state tuition in the state they were coming from. That's no longer the case, but that was the case in the 1980s when I was an undergrad. I'm happy to pay public school taxes, property taxes that support public schools, because somebody did it for me when I was a kid. And quite frankly, if they raised property taxes in Liberty, which they just did, by the way, for the sole purpose of funding public education more, I'd be fine with that. What's the problem with that, though? When property taxes fund education, what does that do to equity in education and public education? Keep in mind that school district boundaries are not the same as municipal boundaries in many cases. School districts are their own separate things. Sometimes they are within the same boundaries as the communities, but sometimes they're not. The Liberty School District actually extends into Kansas City, here in the Liberty area. What happens to public school equity? These are not difficult connections to make. Liberty has good schools because they have high property values, because they then get high rates of property tax paid. What happens in a place with lower property values? Not as much money going in schools. What about the quality of those schools as a result of that? What?
They're not good.
Yeah, probably not as good, simply because there's less money for the physical facilities, but there's also less money to hire teachers, provide after-school programs, do all the things that a place like Liberty would do. Because education is negatively affected. If property values are declining, property taxes decline, public education declines, what does that do to an individual's ability to grow up, go to college, get a job, and be able to get a mortgage and buy a house? Yeah, it hurts them, doesn't it? It negatively affects, in the end, your ability to get a mortgage. And if you live in those communities and you come from those communities, your odds of getting out of this cycle are really pretty low, simply because the system's kind of been set up to kind of keep you there. So this is what redlining does. This is why you can still see the thumbprint of redlining in many of our cities to this day, is because it becomes this kind of self-perpetuating thing. We haven't talked about food at all, but let's think about food for a few minutes in the last couple of minutes that we have here. What does this mean for the availability of food outlets? Adam?
I mean, as a general concept, east of Truce, there's pretty much no grocery stores.
I was bicycling. There's a bicycle ride called the Tour de Hope every year. It happens in May, right around the time the finals are happening. And it's a fundraiser for the Hope Center. And it goes down all through Kansas City. It goes through Kansas City all the way down to Martin City, goes out into the southernmost suburbs and comes back up into the center of the city. Starts out at the Liberty Memorial, it goes over to Cliff Drive, and then it goes through the Italian section where all of the low-grade Italians used to live. And it goes down along Troost and Paseo and those places. And the last couple of years, they haven't had that bike ride because of COVID, but every year I try and ride that route. The nice thing about it when it's a supported ride is they have rest stops set up. Businesses, the Hope Center itself sets up rest stops where you can stop and you can get drink and you can get food, so that when you're riding 68 miles around the city, you don't have to hunt for places to get something to eat and drink. The first time that I did it, I didn't plan well enough. And so you leave Liberty Memorial, you head south, you go down to Martin City, and then you're coming back up. And when you're coming back up, you get into these old red line districts, and I hadn't planned. And I was out of food and I was out of water. And I started looking for a place to get something to eat and something to drink. I couldn't find any place. I finally found this little convenience store. Parked my bike outside, went in, got some food and drink, chatted with the guy for a few minutes. He was waiting the counter. But they're few and far between in certain parts of the city, to the point that I had to ride about 5 miles before I encountered a convenience store. Not a supermarket, a convenience store to get, a little corner store to get something to eat and drink. Why are there not food outlets in these parts of towns that used to be redlined?
Building your grocery store is a big investment.
Okay, so a supermarket is a big investment, but a corner shop is also a big investment. A corner shop is going to cost you easily as much as a house, probably more than a house. Where are you going to get the money to put up a corner store in your neighborhood? What's that? Not with taxes. Pardon?
Wouldn't you have to take a mortgage out on a property?
Well, except that they don't give mortgages to businesses. You would take out a small business loan. So you'd go to a bank, you would say, hey, I want to put a corner store in here, or like how much they'll ask for your business plan. They'll ask you how much you need to get started. They are going to want you to have estimates on how much the store is going to turn over every year, because they're interested in you paying back the small business loan that they're going to give you. If you're in a red line district, what are your odds of getting a small business loan? Same odds as getting a mortgage, because the same banks making home loans are also the same banks making small business loans. So you have a redlined area that's hard to get a mortgage in. It's also a place where it's hard to get a small business loan, and so you don't see businesses thriving in these areas as much, simply because there's not a financial support system to support people starting businesses. I'm going to leave this here for now. Ruminate on this between now and Wednesday. Go and explore the redefining the mapping inequality website some more, since you've now been introduced to it. If you didn't do the homework that I asked you to do, go to the Moodle course. So all these areas that I've been pointing out were in the homework for today. Homework for Wednesday, I want you to go and look at these PowerPoint slides. So I've got PowerPoint slides a number of years ago. So how many of you were familiar with redlining before today? Okay, so it's something that where did you guys learn about it?
My mom talked about it, 'cause, right before I moved, we were like partially, not where we were, because we were in Arlington, but like we're on the border of Fort Worth, and like right where that Fort Worth was a red line area, because there was nothing there.
Yeah.
But in Arlington, it was blue, but right there it was red.
When I was a grad student at the University of Texas at Arlington, I think I mentioned to you that I went to school there. There was a news article in the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, and they did an analysis by postal code of what the most crime-ridden places in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Yeah, my first apartment in Arlington was right in the middle of the worst crime postal code in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. I'm like, maybe I should move.
My mom would tell me every time, she's like, she would hear sirens when she would go to bed.
Yeah. I haven't looked at the redlining maps for Dallas and Fort Worth. I should go and do that just to satisfy my own curiosity, since I did live there for a while. So there's a PowerPoint. So I was not aware of redlining. Where did the rest of you learn about redlining?
Meeting human needs, jewel course.
Oh, okay, that's a dual course. So you didn't learn about it until college. What about the rest of you? Aiden?
You research enough about the history of this country, but you find it eventually.
Yeah, strangely enough, in Texas, you take 2 years of Texas history in your public school and 1 year of US history. And nobody mentioned this when I was in public schools in Texas back in the 70s and 80s. Adam, you mentioned you knew about this. Where from?
I actually have no idea, but I just feel like probably just learning about geography, like specifically Kansas City.
Okay, you guys are all way more enlightened than I was. I didn't know about this until about 5 years ago. So 5 years ago, I started reading about this, and then I stumbled across the Mapping Inequality website. At the time, they didn't have GIS layers for the redlined districts. They just had the physical maps themselves. Over the years, they added GIS layers, and since I have some facility with computing, I began to explore this a little better. A number of years ago, I think it was 4 years ago, I had as one of the assigned projects in this class, I had a much larger group of students, and I divided those students up into 5 different groups, and they went out and they made their best effort to locate all of the convenience stores, supermarkets, and specialty food stores in the Kansas City Metroplex. And we basically built a map. And so there's a PowerPoint presentation in the Moodle folders for Wednesday's materials. It shows you the map of all stores. It shows you a density calculation. So I have some facility with statistics so you can calculate where the highest density of food stores is. And then because the redline maps are now GIS, they're geo-referenced, I can import them into the map and overlay them over the distribution of food and the density map of food. So go and look at those between now and Wednesday. In that same materials for December 8th, there is a interview with a guy who wrote a book about redlining in the United States. It's in Smithsonian Magazine. And then there's also down here a paper called Zhang and Devarshana, I guess is how you pronounce that. Anyway, this is a paper that is about redlining, specifically thinking about food deserts, which is a relatively new topic within people thinking about redlining. So this was published in 2016. There's actually a couple of what look like better papers from 2020 and 2021, but they're paywalled, and I don't have access to them. Although one of them was written by some people at the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago, and it's available not in its final form where it was published, but it's available as a white paper from the Federal Reserve. So I'm going to post a couple of papers. Read this one for Wednesday, just to give you some thoughts as we approach Wednesday and Friday. What I'll do is I'll go through the maps on Wednesday, explain to you how they were formed, and kind of let us think about that. What you're going to do during finals week or between now and finals week is you're going to write a 2-page paper about food deserts, and the assignment is already posted. It'll be due Thursday the 16th of finals week, you can just hand that in at my office. But the specifications for it are in here, basically thinking about food deserts. And then here at the end, Bernie Sanders, when he was running for president, I saw an interview with him. He was walking through Baltimore with a bunch of local citizens in Baltimore, taking a tour of kind of center city Baltimore. And he was being interviewed by reporters as he walked around, and he made some comments. So there's also a Bernie Sanders interview. And if you start about 5 minutes and 15 into the interview, he starts talking about grocery stores, as well as a bunch of other things in there, but that's informative as well. So some stuff to digest between now and Wednesday, so that hopefully you guys come in on Wednesday and we can have a nice productive discussion about food deserts in the Kansas City area. How'd your presentation go?